welcome to the Politicrat. I'm Omar Moore. It is Thursday, December the 31st, 2020. On this episode of the Politicrat, a look back at the first 300 episodes of this podcast. Well, not each and every one of the 300, but a look back at some of the guests and highlights of some of what they had to say to you and I during the course of 2020. Some of that audio is coming up next.
Communities of color, which are in urban centers around the world, but particularly in the United States, your urban center does not have a supermarket. It doesn't have a vegetable market. Things that most people who don't live in urban centers take for granted, right? Many of us take for granted. If I go to my local supermarket, I have aisles of vegetables and fruit. I mean, and where I live, I'm choosing not just from peppers, but are they organically grown? Are they hothouse grown? Are they, there's like 10 types of peppers to choose from. And my mom, who's from the Caribbean, is like, can you pick up a pepper, please? And because, I got to read all the different labels to figure out which one, what fertilizer they use or not. But in an urban center, many times, these are not choices that these people have. So when we're talking to them and wagging our fingers, it's actually out of touch. You're out of touch when you do that, because the truth is they want the same things you have access to. It's not that they don't want to eat healthy food. It's not that they don't want to cook vegetables. But if you don't have access to it, you can't cook what you don't have.
Welcome back. That was audio from my first guest on this podcast, Dr. Cindy Duke, back at the end of April of this year, 2020. I had 32 guests on during the course of this year, and this podcast began on March the 14th, 2020. Innocently enough, if you will. And then, over the course of the next few months, it just began to take shape. Now, make no mistake, there's still lots of improvements to be made and things to be done. But definitely, I must say that it's been a real pleasure to be able to speak to the individuals that I spoke to during the course of this last 9 months or so. I really do want to share with you, in case you have not been able to listen to any of the podcast episodes, some of the interviews that I did, the conversations that I had with the guests that I had, and their insights that I think are highly illuminating, fascinating, and make for good listening as we get to the very end of this year. Here we are on the final day of what has been an absolutely rotten year, to say the least. But I am delighted to end 2020 with this compilation of audio that you're going to be hearing during this episode. And I also will do this at the end of the episode. I want to thank you for your loyalty and your listenership and for your patience with me and the podcast throughout this 2020 calendar year. So without further ado, I'm going to start with one of the 32 guests that I had on, Professor Janet Lorde, she of the University of Birmingham. She had this to say about physical exercise for older adults and the coronavirus. This was back in May of this year.
In the older adult, unfortunately, their adaptive immune system also doesn't work too well. The problem is that when you meet a new virus like the SARS-CoV-2, the coronavirus that we're all troubling with at the moment, you need new cells, new immune cells to do that. They're called T cells, and they develop in an organ called the thymus. It sits just on top of your heart, and that's why they're called T cells. Unfortunately, your thymus starts to shrink from about the age of 20. So that by the time you get to 65 or 70-year-old, you've only got about 3% of it left. So the older adult has less of these new T cells to train up and fight the virus. So those are the two main issues. So your frontline troops are not very good at killing and not very good at finding the infection. And then the smart troops, you haven't got very many of them. So that's why the older adult is more susceptible.
Wow. That is really something, and that is something that I'm sure a lot of people had no awareness of. To that end, Professor Lorde, what kinds of things have you been advocating? Because I know there's actually a video I saw recently that you'd put out, or at least it's been circulating the rounds, of you doing some exercises and telling people to exercise in a particular type of way. Is that right?
That's correct. So what my research has done is also to look, well, are all 70-year-olds alike? Have they all aged? And so what I did was I did some work with 125 older adults who had stayed physically active all of their lives. They were keen cyclists, mad keen cyclists, cycling 100 to 150 kilometres a week, really keen. And they were 55 to 80 years old. And what I found in those cyclists was actually most of their immune system hadn't aged. Their thymus hadn't shrunk. They had as many of these new T cells as a 20-year-old. Yeah, amazing.
Wow.
And interestingly, one of the things that we know also causes you to have more age-related diseases is that you have more inflammation in your body as you get older. Not in the cyclists, they didn't have that. So what I'm doing a lot of work on now is trying to understand why exercise is so good for the immune system. And one of the things is your skeletal muscle turns out to be a key enhancer of your immune system. So when muscle moves, it produces special hormones called myokines, which help your immune system to function better. So that's why these older adults doing lots of exercise have a better immune system. So what I've been doing is trying to get older adults to exercise and whatever they can do. So if they're already quite fit and healthy, try and get those 10,000 steps a day. But if they're a frail older adult who might be doing very little exercise and would struggle to do something, I always say just do something. So if you might only be doing 1,000 or 2,000 steps a day, basically in your apartment, moving around, just do a little bit more. Or follow those exercises I show in the video. They're not difficult. Even a frail older person can do them. But they will all get those muscles moving, get them producing myokines, helping the immune system.
That was Professor Janet Lorde of the University of Birmingham in England. She is the director of the Institute of Inflammation and Aging. And she provided a number of tips about exercising for older adults and how to strengthen the immune system of those of elderly and aging populations, particularly during this coronavirus pandemic, which at that time back in May of this year, we really started to get a full picture of just how serious and severe the coronavirus was. The coronavirus and COVID-19, the disease COVID-19 was very, very serious indeed. And this was also amidst a lockdown in England that had actually been called in late March by Boris Johnson. Now, what's interesting is that literally the following month of April, after that lockdown was announced in March, Boris Johnson himself became very, very ill, gravely ill with coronavirus. As a matter of fact, he was literally on his deathbed. It was extremely serious for him. And there were literally hours where it was not clear whether or not he would make it. He was that close to passing away. And that is not an exaggeration. this year has been an interesting year for Boris Johnson, to say the very least. And on his terms, at least, he ends the year from his point of view in a very triumphant way. But not for my native England or for the United Kingdom at large. It has been a failure, a grand failure, with Brexit and all the rest of it. And this virus that has ravaged England in particular, this new variant, which now has shown up here in the United States as well. So it's been a pretty darn poor year for everybody, and especially when you think about this coronavirus. I had a number of guests on who addressed coronavirus, who talked about the coronavirus, and definitely that was the number one topic, issue, news story of the year, as I alluded to, as did Rose Scott of WABE Radio in yesterday's episode of this podcast. And that really is the dominating theme, and it's going to be in 2021 as well, as we turn the calendar to a brand new year. Psychologically, it will be good to get to 2021, but there's no doubt that the coronavirus will persist with us, vaccine or no vaccine. And it's just a matter of how governments and how people, you and I and everybody we know, and the average person is going to behave before, during, and after getting vaccinated. I had a fascinating conversation also with a member of the House of Lordes in England, Danny Finkelstein, who actually is from my hometown in London, and it was just really great to have him on to talk. And he was talking about Boris Johnson, speak of the devil, and he had some things to say about Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings. And Dominic Cummings, of course, was somebody who was a lot in the headlines in the UK during this calendar year as well. Here's a little bit of what the House of Lords Conservative member Danny Finkelstein had to say.
Has a bit of cut through. But let's take as an example Westland, right? The helicopter purchasing scandal, I'm only saying, I know you know, but to remind listeners, that affected the Thatcher government in the middle of her second term. And Michael Heseltine resigned. It really shook the government. And in 1987, she won a huge victory, right? And it didn't figure at all. Right? Despite the fact that for day upon day upon day, and they lost two cabinet ministers, one walked out, and Margaret Thatcher herself nearly fell. And in the end, I think much more serious for Boris Johnson is that he now faces a serious opposition, and elections are also won on the kind of physical state of the country, and there are two times when that matters. One is the peak, and the other is the end. In 1997, in many ways, at the end was quite benevolent for the Conservatives in terms of the economy, but the peak had been so bad that the party couldn't recover. It may be that that's what this moment is. Not I think Cummings actually, but the question of whether the government has handled the coronavirus well. We think we're too early in the process to be able to make a proper judgment about that. But once that judgment is in, that could turn out to be the peak, and then we'll see what happens at the end as well. And those are the two things that formulate people's view.
Some very interesting insights from Danny Finkelstein. I pronounced his name wrong, so I apologize. His last name is Finkelstein, and he is a member of the House of Lords, the Conservative member of the House of Lords, Danny Finkelstein. It was really great to talk to him, as well as with all the guests I had on in this calendar year on this podcast. I also spoke with Bakari Sellers, he the attorney and author of a book called A Vanishing, or rather My Vanishing Country. He came on for a few minutes to talk about George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement and the political equation here in the United States. Bakari Sellers is also a former South Carolina member of the House there in the legislature, and he is also a CNN political commentator and analyst. It was great to talk to Bakari Sellers as he was talking about his book that had just come out called My Vanishing Country.
Yeah, I talk about the women who are like the old women who sit at the front 2 rows of the church and wear the big hats. And when you hug them, you smell like Chanel number 8 day long. Like they just 2 sticks of butter in there and their sweet potato pies. But they hug, give you life, and they tell you when you're wrong. And they're the backbone of not only your community, but of the Democratic Party as a whole. And I wanted to give them voice. I wanted to give them life. But I also talked about the struggles of Black women and basically saying that for far too long, we've just said thank you, but we've never really truly empowered them in this country and given them their just reward. And I gave the story of my wife who almost died in childbirth, and the issues of African-American female mortality and how important they are. And so I just wanted, this book is a love letter to the South. It's a love letter to my mother and father. It's a love letter to Black women. But it also challenges institutions like the church, like our civil rights organizations, like our media in our country, to do better so we can be a more perfect union.
The wise words and assessments of Bakari Sellers, who you can see on CNN as a political commentator and analyst, and he is an attorney at a law firm, I believe it is in South Carolina, as well as the author of the book, My Vanishing Country, which I highly recommend that you read. It's a really good book, and I think it will be of great impart to you, very edifying as well. Shaistar Aziz is a counselor in Oxford, England, and we spoke at around the time that the statues were falling, literally, in England as the Black Lives Movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, began to take on a really great influence and significance in the conscience, quite frankly, of white people around the world, many of whom joined in the movements for justice for Black people and respect and humanity of Black people and their lives. And that movement reached a tremendous crescendo throughout 2020. An Oxford counselor, Shaistar Aziz, spoke about the Rhodes Must Fall movement. Of course, she refers to Cecil Rhodes, the colonialist, and about his statue being in Oxford, outside the campus of Oxford University, or on one of the buildings there. Here's what she had to say about the general tenor of the movement and what it seems to be doing at the time we spoke in June of this year.
It is a movement led, as it should be, by Black people and people of colour, but there are a lot of young white people who are joining, and then there's also older people who I feel have a lot of wisdom and knowledge, and they have fought these battles, but perhaps in a very polite British way they gave up a little bit too soon, because they kind of thought, well, we've done as much as we can, right? So they're there, and they're the front and the back, and that's really important, because I feel that we have a lot to learn from every generation, right? But without a doubt, it's a very multiracial protest movement. And as I said, it is about all the things we discussed, but it's also about class. And class is, in this country, again, where nobody wants to talk about class, by the way, as you know, class is always the elephant in the room, always, right? But there is this complete, absurdity where in the UK, the only time you talk about class is when you talk about the white working class. And often, well, more than often, the white working class are talked about and they're talked at, okay? There is never a two-way dialogue, but this whole thing about only white people can be working class, and it's like, hello, folks, have you read the history of this country? Do you see what's the current history of this country? The fact that during this pandemic, large numbers of black people and people of color are dying in this country. They are, the class factor doesn't even matter. They can be upper class doctors and senior consultants and, surgeons, or they can be the people on the 0-hour contracts, getting on public transport, literally chancing their lives with COVID-19 in the air, right? Getting to the hospital to go and clean it, the porter in the hospital, the woman, who's a cleaner, all of those things, right? And it's like they just erase our stories and our histories from the DNA of this country. And there's pushback going on. We're done. We're really bored and we're done. And I feel that this is a movement. I do think that. I really do. I think that it will stop and start. We've got to be realistic. If this requires a lot of energy, people are exhausted. But I think something very profound is going on.
Shaistar Aziz, a terrific conversation with her. And I had a fascinating conversation with the anti-racist educator, Jane Elliott, who is a white woman who for decades now has been doing the work all over America and beyond in terms of anti-racist education. And she has been speaking to and educating white people since the late 1960s with her experiments in class on young white children and students and older white people, white adults in particular, that have been televised and shared the world over. Jane Elliott was doing the work long before people like, well, should I name the person? The person who wrote the book White Fragility had ever come into existence. And not only that, Jane Elliott wasn't writing books about how fragile white people were. She was writing and speaking and teaching about the cancer of whiteness in societies and what white people were doing wrong and what they needed to do correctly and to change their behaviors. Jane Elliott challenges and has challenged white people for so long now. She says that she has become used to being threatened by members of her own group. Here's some of what Jane Elliott had to say. It's a very dangerous thing that the media does when it rebroadcasts these lynchings. It's very dangerous.
But they have to remember that the people who are paying the funds for that and who are supporting that and who own those corporations are people who have been raised to believe in the myth of race. They do what they have been taught to do. It isn't that they are stupid. You can't fix stupid. It is that they are ignorant and they need to be educated. It's people like you and people like me who are going to remind them, look, fellas, you need to go back and get re-educated. You need to take some courses that will teach you what you haven't learned yet. You need to read the book, The Rage of a Privileged Class. You need to read the book, The Color of Law. You need to read the book, The Racial Conditioning of Our Children by Nathan Rutstein. You need to get the April 2018 issue of National Geographic magazine. These so-called men need to be re-educated. You can't teach what you don't know, and you only practice what you've learned. And if you've learned the myth of race, then you believe it, you practice it, you talk it, you walk it, you believe it. And if it makes you feel good and it makes you feel more powerful, why wouldn't you do it? Because it's damaging your children and your grandchildren, and the end is in sight. Within 30 years, white people will be a numerical minority in the United States of America. And that is what is scaring white folks to death. And they're saying to themselves, if they get power, they're going to want to treat us the way we have treated them. So instead of changing the way we treat one another, we try to keep people in power who will perpetuate the status quo, instead of realizing that we're damaging every one of us, not just people of color, but so-called colorless people are being damaged by having to hold people down and to believe this lie. It's time to tell the people who are writing about white fragility that white fragility is really white ignorance. And white privilege is another form of white ignorance. The person who wrote that list of white privileges, each of those says, I can do this because of my race. I have this privilege because of my race. Well, somebody should tell her there's only one race. And if she has those privileges because of her race, since we're all the same race, then we all must have those privileges, right?
Right.
The whole thing is built on a faulty premise, and there are people running around the country using white privilege to make a lot of money. And I like for people to make a lot of money, no doubt about it, but not to make a lot of money perpetuating a lie.
Wow. And they're the ones that get invited on all these shows for the reasons that you've outlined.
Oh, absolutely. And I understand that too, because the people who are doing the talking on the talk shows look like them and think the way they do. So what do you expect? You expect them to listen to me, a little old, short, fat, ugly, white female who doesn't know enough to keep her place. Do you not realize, bitch, that you are a bitch? And I say, yeah, for me, bitch is an acronym for being in total control, honey. So go ahead and call me that. And I laugh because I think, fool, you're out of control, aren't you, darling? I take care of that for you. And then I whip out my little Lorena Bobbitt fruit knife, and that shuts them up in a hurry. Oh, you see, I'm all out of patience.
It was great to get a real education from Jane Elliott. I mean, I had known much of what she was speaking of, but I was unaware of some of the books that she mentioned. One of them, The Color of Law, a very good book, and it escapes me the author's name. I think his first name is Richard, but just search for The Color of Law. The Color of Law. If you look that book up, you'll find his last name as well. I strongly urge you to read that book, among others. I strongly urge you to listen to that episode. I really think that the episode I did there in, I guess it was in late May or in June, with the one and only Jane Elliott, is one that you really should and must listen to. I really do believe you should. It's a learning tool, one that you definitely, and it was the end of June I spoke with Jane Elliott. It's a really important episode for everybody, especially I think for white people to listen to. Jane Elliott is someone you need to really acquaint yourself with. Not people who, I don't want to cast aspersions, but I really do think that you should listen to Jane Elliott. I mean, if there's anybody white in the anti-racist movement that you should be listening to, it really is her. Really. Because she's been around the block a few times, put it that way. She has lots of experience, and she tells it to you straight. There is no chaser. And as you listen to that episode, as you listen to those comments, but if you listen to the full episode, Jane Elliott does not play around. And she was one of the most lively and incisive guests that I had the pleasure of having on this year. And it was her unbridled honesty and her passion and fierce commitment to justice, and also to eradicating from white people that poison of racism and that racist attitude that lies either dormant or latent or explicit in white people. And it's something that she spares no blushes on. And I really enjoyed her honesty about the subject and about Donald Trump as well, who she spoke of during the course of our conversation. When I return, some more audio clips from some of the guests who I had the pleasure of speaking to this year. During the course of 2020, I had 3 guests on twice. One of them was none other than Manju Kulkarni. She is the executive director of A3P Con, and it was a delight to speak to her. This audio you're going to hear is from the first time she was on the podcast during the summer of this year. And, we were talking about the things that were going on in this state of California, but all over the country, the attacks, and these racist attacks, these violent attacks on Asian people in the United States, on Americans who are Asians, Americans, attacks by largely white and sometimes black, but largely white men who would go around in California, including here in San Francisco, and violently attack Asian people, whether it's Asian young men or young boys or Asian girls or Asian women. It was open season with racists and violent people attacking Asian people. And it wasn't just here in California or just here in the United States. It was all over the world. Same thing happened in London on Oxford Street and numerous other places around the UK and beyond. Here is Manju Kulkarni with these words.
So we have been, while we've tried to be allies in many situations, I think we've also been complicit in many other situations as a community, as individuals. And I want to just point to one thing, and this is another long answer, is when we look at Maya Angelou's writing, Toni Morrison's writing, apologies, around the racial ladder and really what immigrant communities know and understand the minute they arrive on our soil, which is the ladder puts white people at the top and has put Black and Latino communities on the bottom. And so immigrants know and understand that. And what happens then with Asian American immigrants, such as myself and my family members, my parents and I came when I was 2, is they see that, and then what do they try to do? Align themselves with white people, because they know that's where the power lies, and that's where the opportunities lie. And so it really is, I think, a time of reckoning for all of us, and for us to call that out. It's important to talk about anti-AAPI hate, but we cannot, I don't want to conflate it in any way with what has been experienced by our Black sisters and brothers for the course of 400 years.
I actually covered a lot of bases in 2020 on the Politicrat Daily Podcast, and it wasn't always a conversation about politics or about voting, although certainly those were two very important things that you, if you are a regular listener to this podcast, heard most often in 2020 on this podcast. And I also talked about things going on in the entertainment business, the entertainment industry. I did tributes to some of those who passed away in the entertainment industry. Chadwick Boseman. That was heartbreaking in August of this year. I believe it was August, to learn that he had passed away. Earlier in the year, Little Richard, who I did speak about, but most of all paid tribute to people like Bill Withers, who passed away, I believe it was April of this year, or thereabouts. Bill Withers was one of those indispensable people, and just like everybody who passed away, I miss them all already. And Bill Withers was one of the special people as well. And, he was one of the decent people too. So I do want to just remember him and just think about him for a few seconds here. It's amazing that we lost, and sad that we lost so many people this year. All walks of life, famous and not famous, as I've talked about very recently earlier this week. But it is worthwhile thinking of people who touch you, people who you listen to in a younger age, and listen to still today, like Bill Withers, one of many who passed away this year. There's someone who is very much alive in the entertainment music industry, and that's Lady A, or make that the real Lady A. And this year I had occasion to have a conversation with her very kindly in her very busy schedule. Stopped by on the Politicrat Daily Podcast with her manager, John Oliver III, a producer, John Oliver III, I should say, to talk about what was going on with the group Lady Antebellum, who appropriated and stole the identity of Lady A and made it their own, while not really at all compensating in any way, shape, or form the real Lady A. That's what she goes by right now, and I would definitely like to talk to her again in 2021 to find out where things are at this moment. But at the moment she and I got to speak during this calendar year, this was some of what the real Lady A had to say.
This was both with the lawyers, the talk with the lawyers, and the talks with the artists. And Omar, I say everything in threes because I like to make sure that people understand. So I said, well, what does coexistence look like? Because I'm thinking to myself, I'm thinking as a businesswoman, as soon as you put something out as Lady A, you're going to wipe me off of social media,
right,
off of iTunes, Amazon, and Spotify. Because I always knew they were there. It was Lady Antebellum and it was Lady A. Always. I always knew they were there. I had no idea that their fans called them Lady A. Why would I? You're putting out CDs as Lady Antebellum. You haven't put out any CDs as Lady A. So there was never a problem. There would never be a problem. And then you say, let's coexist. What does that look like? What does coexistence look like? For the people in the back that can't hear me, what does coexistence look like? We asked that question with the lawyers and with the artists. And my little spidey senses start to go up when people aren't forthcoming when you're asking a question. Because now I'm thinking, well, wow, are you seriously just going to dismiss me like I didn't just say something? And that's how I started to feel. And they really wanted to do this Zoom call. They really wanted to get something out into the press. And I know why they wanted to do it. And I understood it. And I was willing to try, but you got to meet me halfway. And they, like John said, they never offered in the contracts that they sent back. It said, we'll do our best efforts. Okay, I mean, you're laughing. You know, even you're laughing. It's like, okay, so my question, what does best efforts mean?
Right.
For the people in the back, what does best efforts mean? Nothing. Nobody answered a question. They didn't address us. At least address me and say, Omar, you asked me a question, and then I go, well, you know what, we're going to get back to that. They never even said that. They just kept sitting, and then the second contract came back the same way. We'll do our best efforts. So finally I was like, you know what, this has no substance. The agreements have no substance. You're only looking out for Lady Antebellum.
Right.
So Lady A is going to look out for Lady A. You want to coexist and you want to say that we can share this name when I know that is not possible. No, it's possible in your world because you'll wipe me off social media. You don't really care what happens to me. Yet you said Black Lives Matter.
That is...
Remember, I didn't say that.
Right.
Said that.
Right. Well, obviously it sounds to me as if they were disingenuous from the very start. They erased you or tried to erase you at least twice. Once by using your name. Secondly, by absolutely, when it came to you negotiating with them, not saying anything, as you point out. I mean, it seems like they tried to erase you twice. Once by using your name, and secondly, by not listening to you or offering anything in the negotiation stage.
And you're right, they were disingenuous because the entire time that they were texting and, the phone calls and all that kind of thing. Because why would a $41 million company call an an independent artist.
Right.
Because you dangled this carrot in front of our nose that said, look, let's do a song together. Then we'll, we can document it and show everybody how we're going to kumbaya. That song didn't impress me. I got songs of my own. I don't need to do a song with you. I was willing to try, but I'm not signing nothing and I'm not singing anything until I know what coexistence looks like. Because you thought that I was excited because you wanted to do a song together. All you wanted to do is what most white people do, which is have us come sing and dance for you, make it seem like we're all getting along, and then when you're done with me, I'm wiped off of social media, and you're done with me. Because you'll be like, well, we tried to help you. Tried to help me do what? I was fine before you came along. Yes, I thank God. I am forever truly thankful. The Lord knows I am. For the new fans, for the people who are supporting us, for the wonderful emails. I'm even thankful for you haters out there because y'all need a job. I'm even thankful for y'all. But that's not what propels me. That's not what encourages me. I like to help people. I like to bring people together. And I know malarkey when I see it. And I saw that in them. Because the entire time that they were, sending these contracts back and forth, they were already slowly wiping me off social media.
Now, Lady A, and I'm talking about the real Lady A, has been performing in the music business for well over 30 years now. And literally, when she started out, the people in the Lady Antebellum group, now they cut short their name to Lady A because they were getting some kind of backlash in light of the assassination of George Floyd. And they felt, we should just change our name so that we can look a little bit better. But all of it was done with ill intent. And certainly the real Lady A had something to say about that. And what happened is that when Lady A began her career, and an illustrious career at that, the members of the band Lady Antebellum were all in diapers practically. I mean, all of them were under 5 years old. Some of them had not even been born yet. And all of a sudden they come around and just take her name. It sounds very much like enslavement to me. But that's my view. What's yours? I'll tell you a subject that was talked about on this podcast by another guest who I've had on twice in this calendar year, Ruth Ben Giat. She is the professor of history and Italian studies at New York University. And from this conversation, the first of the two that we had this year, we talked about fascism and authoritarianism. And Ruth was very clear about exactly what fascism was and is, and the toxic masculinity that undergirds it. She wrote a book this year that is now available called Strong Men, Mussolini to the Present, which I spoke with her about later on in the year. But here is some of what she had to say during our first conversation back in the summer. Whether it's these politicians who enable someone like a Donald Trump, for example, or the culture and the advertising around that is designed to kind of pinprick people, the not dog whistles, because this isn't dog whistle anymore, the things that Trump's saying now. Isn't this also a part of the authoritarian culture too? I mean, I'm sure it predates that, Professor, but I just wanted to get your perspective on the language and the atmosphere that gives rise to this, the kinds of verbiage that give rise to it, whether it's these ads, whether it's the kinds of bullhorns that are being used by Trump and others. Can you talk about that? And does that figure into the work that you've you've written about, the things that you've done in terms of your research and your writings?
Absolutely. I mean, these kinds of rulers need enemies. They thrive on enemies, and it's always very interesting if you track regimes, some of them quite long-lasting, to see how some enemies are constants, like the left for right-wing authoritarians, and then others come and go. Mussolini didn't persecute the Jews until 1938, 16 years after he came from power, but he had other enemies. And at times of difficulty for the ruler, such as terrible economy or, badly handled medical crisis, you see an uptick in the spreading of hatred. And so the newest enemy, so with Trump it was, migrants from the start. It was, he used anti-Semitism. The first pieces I ever did for CNN in 2015 was one about how he was retweeting right-wing propaganda that was against Hispanic people, and the other was when he did the Jewish star of Clinton and trying to link her to Jewish interests. But what's also interesting is, so unfortunately, Trump didn't have to work very hard to convince many Americans, white Americans, to dislike and distrust migrants or people of color. But he did have to work much harder to get people to hate the press. So you also want to look at, who's being vilified and when and why. So the latest enemy of the state is protesters, who are now being labeled as domestic terrorists. And this, of course, is because of the Black Lives Matter protests, but also in view of the election. So it's been interesting to see that even though we're a nominal democracy, the drumming of state propaganda, because Fox News is like a de facto, state media machine, the drumming up of the latest, all the forces that coalesce to vilify the latest enemy. And this is something that anybody who studies regimes, whether they're communist or fascist or whatever, knows very well. And it's terrifying when you see the beginning of a new enemy and how all the forces of media messaging and start to drum. I use the word drum up because it's like a slow burn. It's really terrifying.
I had a wonderful conversation with Dr. Avis Jones DeWeaver. Dr. Avis Jones DeWeaver can be seen on Roland Martin Unfiltered. She also has a media group called Max Black Media, which you will have to watch out for in 2021 as it goes and takes off for liftoff. And I'll be looking forward to seeing what Max Black Media does in this new calendar year coming up in just a few, not too long at all from now. I'm excited to see what that company does. And it was great to talk to Dr. Avis. We had a conversation, among many other things, about politics and also about great black women in history, particularly in the United States. And here is some of how that conversation went.
But I would have to say it is really a beautiful thing. In fact, it's so beautiful, I wrote a whole book about it, okay? And my book is called How Exceptional Black Women Lead, in which I really sort of delve down into the essence of what Black women's leadership looks like. And here's the thing, as you recognize here, we're born leaders, right? We have been leading for centuries. And oftentimes, though, we lead without that official designation. We lead without the official recognition of the contributions that we make in various ways, contributions that, as you mentioned, have changed the world. And so I think what's so brilliant and amazing and perhaps to an extent unique about the way Black women lead is that Black women are really about getting it done. Oftentimes, we're more focused on getting the work done than getting the credit. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, although I would like more of our leaders to get the recognition and the kudos. But the bottom line is we preference the advancement over the pomp and circumstance. And so to me, that is really the essence of a true leader. And also, I believe that's what's beautiful about our leadership is that we understand that when we move forward, we want to bring other people with us. And we tend to be more in the vein of inclusive leadership. We tend to be more in the vein of servant leadership. We tend to be in the tradition of lifting as we climb. So that is just how we do it. We don't tend to be sort of this, I want to be the center of attention and I'm the only one who has the say and everybody fall in line behind me. We build leaders as we lead. And to me, that is the beauty of what Black women's leadership looks like. And it's our responsibility as the recipients of so much hard work from so many sisters who have got us to where we are right now, to at least do them the respect, as you just did, of honoring their accomplishments, learning about them. Because as I mentioned, oftentimes they're not the ones that are highlighted in the history books, but they have done incredible work to create the advantages that unfortunately many of us take for granted today.
And so many, as you point out, people who are unsung and not, and as you say, a lot of the women that we've talked, that I mentioned, some of the, many people not interested in credit, they're getting the work done and shaping the future for all of us as Black people and by a larger extent, the nation. There's a lot of great contributions and leadership things that Black women have done. I mean, I think instantly of Harriet Tubman and what she did during the Civil War and just after that. And, her leadership is immense and doesn't get the real credit. I mean, she gets talked about, but not the kind of credit that, say, someone who is white would clearly get for doing things that she did.
Yeah, she's incredible. We typically only know the tip of the iceberg of what people think of her. Okay, Moses, she saved slaves. Look, she did. She did lead enslaved people to freedom, but she also did so much more, as you mentioned, in terms of just her fierceness on the battlefield in the Civil War and so much more. So absolutely.
Claire Pearsall is the counselor for New Ash Green in Kent, England. And right now in Kent, there's a Tier 4 restriction, as there is in fact, more than 3/4 of England, which means that the only reason people should be out is for absolute necessities. But the conversation I had with Councillor Pearsall dealt with Brexit to a degree, but really much more about Dominic Cummings and his behavior. Here's what she had to say about the senior advisor to Boris Johnson. At the time, we all were speculating and thinking that he was going to go in 6 weeks from the time we spoke. A couple more things I wanted to ask you. One of them is about Dominic Cummings. I don't know how much you would really like to talk about Mr. Cummings. So obviously your discretion on how you're going to respond to it. Because in about 6 weeks, I'll be popping some champagne. I'll be honest with you.
You're not alone. You're not alone.
So could you talk about him now? Because we know now that he is going to be on his way out, and a lot of people, including many conservatives, have spared no blushes about it. They have been very frank about it. I was watching Sky News, and I forget his name now, but one of the Lords, I believe, or someone had made it very, Sir Roger, I don't know whom.
Sir Roger Gale,
thank
the
you.
MP for North Thanet.
Thank you.
He was very, very forthright.
Oh, he did. Yeah. He made it very clear how he felt. So can you talk a bit about Mr. Cummings and where you might stand on him and the news of this departure that's coming?
Where do you start? I think that you're not alone in celebrating in 6 weeks' time that he is gone. I am waiting to see the detail of quite how he will leave. You know, it's all been put out that he will leave, but will he still have an advisory role? I worry that he won't be in post as a permanent individual, but that he will have some kind of influence over the Prime Minister in a consultancy type basis. I worry about that because I think you either need to remove him as a whole. You can't have a mix and match approach. He's a very divisive character, and I think it's useful to understand he's not a member of any political party, certainly not the Conservative Party. So he doesn't have those interests at heart. He's worked within Parliament. He was obviously a special advisor to Michael Gove, but he has never worked alongside an MP and their constituency. So he doesn't understand that the public have a really big hold over that member of Parliament. Quite obviously, we rely upon those people to turn out and vote. So you have to help. You have to be collegiate with them. You know, there's a lot of the stuff that you have to do, which I don't think he understands. He also doesn't understand that in Downing Street, you have to work with the parliamentary party. You can't just dismiss them as irrelevant or moaners or, you know, whiners, which is what he's called a number of people. You can't do that. And, you know, to have the rule of, I will sack you if, you say something I don't like. Well, ruling by fear never works. You know, this isn't a dictatorship. We are in a democracy, whether he likes it or not. So I think, you know, he's put a lot of people's backs up over a long period of time. I think he also went incredibly wrong with his trip in April to Barnard Castle in Durham. And I think that was a turning point for people that maybe had never heard of him before. Suddenly went, well, hang on a minute. Who is this person? Why can he break the rules? He's the one with the Prime Minister's ear. Well, you know, what's going on? And trying to protect him from that was impossible, especially with people like me that came out there and said, no, he has to go. And I think I called for that sometime in April. So I might be getting my wish for Christmas. So, you know, there is a benefit to us all.
It was a joy to talk to Councillor Claire Pearsall, the Conservative out of New Ash, Kent in England, talking about Dominic Cummings, who, by the way, literally left the very same day. In fact, as we were talking, he was literally making his way out of 10 Downing Street, I found out. It was about an hour or so after that conversation that we had back on Friday the 13th of November 2020 that Dominic Cummings literally packed his bags, walked out the front door of 10 Downing Street and down the street, literally. It turned out that he hadn't officially left. He was still getting paid money, and he was formally transitioning out of the role of special advisor, or I should say senior advisor. Cummings ended up leaving for good and for proper and officially about 2 weeks or so, maybe more, after that conversation we had, officially leaving, severing ties. It also turned out that he was being paid since the announcement that he was going to leave, that he was getting paid an extra £40,000 to £45,000. This is a guy who broke the lockdown rules and should have been sacked on the spot back in April of this year when he did it. A lot of people, a lot of politicians broke the rules in any number of different countries during this calendar year, while the general public, for the most part, were faithful to the rules and did everything they could to follow them, with, of course, as I said, a few exceptions. But the general public were the ones who did as best they could, while politicians broke the rules, thought that the laws did not apply to them, and then had the temerity to turn around and say that personal responsibility on behalf of the public was an imperative thing. Smacks of a bit of hypocrisy, don't you think? I have to say that Attorney Judith Brown Dianis, the racial justice attorney, was a guest that I thoroughly enjoyed having a conversation with. We talked about history, about the law, and about racism, and how black attorneys were being targeted. This was during the course of the coup attempt that has been going on for several days here in the United States, when Donald Trump and the Republicans constantly challenged black voters in a number of different states that Joe Biden had won in, and won convincingly in. This was not Florida 2000. This was not a matter of 537 votes. This was tens of thousands of votes that Joe Biden had won by. Tens of thousands. In some cases, more than 150,000 votes, if not more than that, even. And yet, Donald Trump and the Republicans were challenging over and over and over again. It was a naked coup attempt in the cold light of day. And Judith Brown Dianis shared her thoughts on some of this. Brad Raffensperger, that's a whole nother story altogether, right? He's got unclean hands with Stacey Abrams and the purging and all of that. Right. And there was a lawsuit this year or last year that
he would be the last person to be cooking the books for a Democrat.
Right.
That is not happening in the state of Georgia. No. Yeah, I mean, it's ridiculous. Even the thought of them, but, and then for Senator Lindsey Graham to be allegedly pushing on him, is just, that's just like old boy voter suppression stuff. We're just going to come for you. Yeah. It's, this is a ongoing fight that we will have. And I think that what has happened is our turnout and our numbers have shifted the conversation for them. And, so it will be like, what's the next thing that they can do? And, we're getting ready to go into redistricting cycle. And so that too, where redistricting is the tool by which we divide political power in this country by neighborhood, by geography. And so that for them is they want to be in control of that process so they can, again, not only elect the people that they want, but also make sure that they maintain the power for, when you draw redistricting lines, it's really 10 to 20 years worth of power you're talking about.
The Oscar-winning filmmaker Alex Gibney made for a really good conversationalist, and I appreciated his time as we talked about his documentary, Totally Under Control.
Sometimes narration writing is tricky in a documentary because sometimes it can lead, sometimes it shouldn't lead, sometimes it should definitely follow. But also, I think it should add something that the pictures don't give you, or else why are you doing it? You're just, saying what the pictures and the sounds are saying. So all those things went into a pretty fertile collaboration. But the molecular structure is an interesting idea, particularly for a film about a virus. And I do think that there were very consciously molecules or sections of the film that we focused on, and that we would move from one to the other, and we would constantly move those pieces around to try to find the best structure for telling the overall narrative. And that was tricky because there is, as you say, a timeline, and time is a character, time is the enemy of defeating the virus, because the virus spreads very quickly. If you don't eradicate it quickly, you're in a lot of trouble. But also in terms of a narrative structure, we were playing both with a kind of a rough chronology, but not so rough that it undermined the kind of story we were telling. And getting that right, when to violate the chronology and when not to, those were some of the toughest decisions that we had to make in terms of getting the story right.
Last but certainly not least, Christina Patterson, who it was a real pleasure to speak to earlier this month on this podcast, is someone who I really felt inspired by it in a great many ways. All of the adversity in her life that she's gone through, and yet such a core of strength in her that makes her one of the more fascinating and interesting and candid guests that I've spoken to and spoke to during the year 2020. We had a conversation about a number of things, including the United States and the United Kingdom. And of course, Boris Johnson showed up as well during our conversation. Not literally, but we did speak about him as well. But in this audio clip, you're going to hear what Christina Patterson describes as her 2 best moments of 2020. By the way, Christina Patterson, if I didn't mention it, is an author, activist, writer, broadcaster, podcaster, and commentator in the United Kingdom. Here's what she had to say about her 2 favorite moments in an otherwise horrible year.
For me, personal things aside, my 2 best moments of the year were when it was clear that Biden had won, and when the news of the Pfizer vaccine broke. I was dancing around the house. I just thought, there is hope. And I think our political situation is very bad. But yours has been, as you say, fascism is the word. And anyone who's read about the 1930s, I recently read a very good book, which I think you'd like. It's called The Art of Fairness by a writer called David Bodanis. And it's about how decent human beings can succeed, which is a message we need to hear now, because unfortunately a lot of the non-decent human beings have been, particularly in politics, have been the ones who have been more prominent in many countries throughout the world, and certainly in yours. And about half the book is taken to 2 case studies. One is a shy, young, wannabe writer with a Jewish girlfriend. He wants to write poems and novellas and become a writer. And the other one is about a spoilt young heir, very arrogant, snobbish, and the different directions their lives took. And the second one was FDR, who, scion of privilege, who then became one of the most significant presidents in American history and introduced Social Security and all the things, and the New Deal and so many things that were absolutely vital in recent American history. And the other one was Goebbels, who turned from an aspiring poet and novelist to, as we know, the chief propagandist of, one of the most evil regimes in global history. And it shows that these things kind of, rest almost on a toss of a coin, that people are not intrinsically good or bad. They can be nudged in one direction or another. But what really chilled me reading about Goebbels was how he used his literary gifts to shift people towards evil, essentially. And I have no admiration for Donald Trump, but anyone looking at him or listening to him over the last few years would have to have some admiration. I mean, shocked, horrified, disgusted admiration for his rhetorical gifts, because that is his gift, that somehow or other he has managed to hoodwink 70 million Americans into thinking that his racist, sexist, misogynistic, fascist message, or which is kind of tied in with this Make America Great slogan, is worth signing up to. And he has done that. And to have actually convinced almost half the American electorate that a democratic election overseen by election observers, including Republican election observers, was stolen. I mean, that is a truly horrifying moment in our history. And it's going to take, I think Joe Biden is a good man. I'm very relieved that he will be president. Obviously, he's not Obama. I wish he was, but he isn't. But I think he will have his work cut out in trying to tackle the damage that has been done.
It was a great pleasure to talk to Christina Patterson. She is someone who I think was one of the most engaging guests that I have spoken to. Someone I think was the most open guest too. She was very candid and open and honest about herself and her experiences in life and the adversity that she has gone through. And she provided a great template, I think, of strength too. She is very strong, and it's one of the things I was really impressed by her about her strength and her core. And so I found Christina Patterson to be a most interesting guest, and I thank her for her time, as I do all of the guests I have spoken to. I had a really great time this whole year doing this podcast. At least I began it in March, and to have done 300 episodes, and now this is the 301st episode, in just 9 months. I mean, every single day, an episode. I really, I'm going to pat myself on the back for that, you know? If you don't toot your own horn, who will? It's not that other people haven't done that, and I appreciate very much your kind words, those of you who have supplied them. But it is also good to acknowledge yourself as well. And it doesn't have to be in a braggadocio way, but it's just to acknowledge that you in your life are doing things that mean something, that matter, no matter how large or small they are. So give yourselves a pat on the back as well for the things that you've done in 2020 that are really meaningful, not just to you, but have touched somebody else. Maybe you didn't even know that they did. I want to thank you also, as well as I have thanked the 33 people I just read out. I want to thank you, most importantly, once again, for listening. Whether you listen for 5 minutes, 5 seconds, 5 hours, 5 days, or all 300 episodes, I'll make that 301 now. Thank you very much indeed. Please continue to spread the word about the Politicrat Daily Podcast. I promise that this podcast that I'm doing will get better, will improve, because anybody who thinks that their product is completely top of the line and has no room for improvement is really living in a land of delusion. It doesn't matter who you are. You have to continue to raise your game. And by the way, for those of you listening, it is easy to start a podcast. It really, truly is. You can do exactly the same thing that I am doing. You have to stay committed, you have to stay focused, and you have to commit to trying to raise the quality of what you are doing. It is something that is no mystery, but it is hard work that is always the key to success, perseverance, connections, getting involved, never giving up, and never giving in. Never, ever, ever giving in. You have to keep working to get the results you want. So if you're someone who thinks, well, you know what, I should be getting out there and putting my voice out there, make sure you do it. Millions and millions of people are podcasting right now. And you have to. If you feel that you've got something passionate to say, if you have something that you want to get off your chest, but not only that, if you want to do it on a regular basis, believe me, come on down. Join all of us. Join the millions of us who podcast. Some of us are good. Some of us are not so good. Some of us are better. Some of us are at the top. But we all have things that we can do better. But at the risk of lecturing, I want to thank you all so very much here in 2020 for listening to yours truly and listening to this Politicrat podcast on a daily basis. I am so pleased that you have done that, and it means so much to me that you have. I hope you continue to listen to this podcast in 2021. I hope you continue to spread the word about the podcast and get people to subscribe to it. There's going to be a lot more to come next year, and I hope that it will be a happier, safer, and better year for all of you, for all of us, and for this planet. For now, that concludes this whole year. My goodness gracious me, we've made it to the end. It's been a tough year, and I hope that we will meet again on the other side of this year. It's been an honor to speak to you, and it's been an honor to have you listening to me during 2020. Thank you ever so much for listening to this and any other edition of the Politicrat Daily Podcast in 2020. I'm Omar Moore, wishing you Happy New Year.